All right, Matthew, a question from Sunday morning, and it has to do not with the 1 Corinthians text, which is fine. Questions from all over the Bible are fine, or any other thing. It's about Matthew 15:14 through 16 versus Matthew 6:1 through 4. And the text, in fact, I'm in the process of trying to memorize Matthew 5:1 through 16 or 1 through 17 right now. And the text that the person's referring to is, let your light shine in such a way that people will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Whereas Matthew 6 is a caution about be careful about performing your works before men so as to be observed by them or credited by them, as it were. And the person's asking, what's the difference between the two practically? And the answer is a couple-fold. Number one is that let your light shine, or you are the salt of the earth. Let your light shine before men so people see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Follows the 9 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, gentle, peacemakers, pure at heart. And so those are some very specific attitudes of the heart. And the motive of living out these good works is so that people would say, wow, that person's a very peace-loving person. That person's very merciful. That person has a hunger and thirst for righteousness. And that when you see those things, you'll glorify God in heaven. Matthew 6 is very specific to religious practices of giving, praying, and fasting. And the whole notion there is that those three things are directly related between the person and God. In other words, my giving is I'm giving to God. I'm not giving for the purpose of showing other people. And so the difference between Matthew 5, which has to do with interpersonal relationships, blessed are the poor in spirit, gentle, those who are peacemakers, those who are merciful, those attributes have to do with other people. And so what Jesus is talking about there is live out these Beatitudes in such a way that people will see your good works, having these attitudes and the application of these attitudes in actions, will see your good works and say, wow, God is really good. In other words, we don't want to just be peacemakers. We want to be peacemakers so people will glorify God. We don't want to just hunger and thirst for righteousness. We want to do it so people will glorify God. And so there's these blessings that promise for the individual. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. But in addition to that, I think Jesus then applies it and says, by the way, as you're merciful to other people, what will happen is that good work, which has to be done before other people. It's impossible to be merciful or to be a peacemaker or to be gentle without other people being involved. It's just impossible. And so in that regard, Jesus is basically putting a check on those things to say those things should be done with the motive of glorifying God. The flip side of that is in Matthew 6 of giving, praying, and fasting. Jesus says those things are really between the person and God. And those things should be done in an attitude not to show how good a giver I am or how good a prayer I am or how good at fasting I am. Those kinds of religious acts, which are worship of God directly between me and God. I don't pray so that you'll hear it and be impressed. I do show gentleness so that you'll see the gentleness and glorify God, but I should give in a way that it's between me and God. And so Matthew 5 has to do with interpersonal relationships lived out from the Beatitudes, and Matthew 6 has to do with the religious practices, specifically of giving, praying, and fasting. And so, first of all, the nature of the activities are different. Number two is the desire of the heart between the two is very different. In one case, in Matthew 6, I want God to see my humble prayer, my giving, my fasting. I want Him to deal with it and reward me for it. Whereas in the others, I really do want people to know that God is a God of mercy and peace. And how do I show that? Well, by being merciful and peaceful, so they'll see the nature of God in that regard. And so in the case of giving, praying, and fasting, that's that the nature of those has to do with personal, and the nature of those others has to do with interpersonal relationship. And that motive of those things driving how we deal with that. And so I think that's the difference between those texts and how they're lived out practically. My interpersonal relationships are public. There's no other choice. How I deal with people is public. And then my motive in how I do that is so that they'll see my goodness and glorify God, not me. My giving, fasting, and praying is private. And how I do that is a private matter. And so practically speaking, that's the difference between those two sections in the Sermon on the Mount. All right, number 2 question, how is an expectant prayer for the salvation of a loved one different from the name it and claim it? Please give an example of each. Well, the very simple thing is that the Scripture actually calls us to pray for people expectantly for their salvation. Paul himself actually told the church, pray for me for an open door that I may preach in such a way that people will hear the gospel and respond. He actually encourages this kind of prayer for salvation. Jesus says, pray for laborers to go into the harvest, for the harvest is ready, or white unto harvest, and we need laborers. And so this kind of prayer for expectation of salvation is part of the New Testament Scripture. And so there's examples where Jesus, in John chapter 4, where he says, beseech the Lord of the harvest, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he would send workers into the harvest. And he does that as the people from Sychar, from the woman at the well's testimony, come out to him. And he says to the disciples, look, you're going to harvest a crop that you didn't plant. And he says, pray in this regard. So there's an example of that kind of prayer. Paul's prayer, pray for people to come to faith. These kinds of things. Paul himself says we're praying. The end of Romans has this prayer kind of related around this. You see this at the end of a lot of Paul's letters of praying for the knowledge of God to be known, and that people would come to a knowledge of God through the obedience of the faith. That's kind of the phrase Paul uses. And so those are examples. Examples of name it, claim it. I don't see, the name it, claim it normally is associated around the idea of wealth, health, and prosperity. And within the New Testament, health, wealth, and prosperity, there are times of healing, but the reality is, for the most part, the apostles, first of all die martyrs' deaths in complete poverty. Paul himself says that suffering is an aspect of the Christian life. And so the name it, claim it actually undermines the whole notion that believers are called to live a sacrificial life, to live a life not of wanton pleasure, but to live a life of discipline and even at times suffering for the sake of the gospel and the call of God. And that's very different than the name it, claim it gospel, which we hear in various circles, or prosperity gospel, as you hear. And so the difference between those two is really different in that the New Testament actually commands us, encourages us to pray for the salvation of other people. And the New Testament also commands us to embrace suffering and trials and difficulties. And I would say the name it, claim it world, prosperity gospel world, it runs counter to the whole notion of the New Testament of suffering for the sake of Christ. And then one last one. Is it jealousy or to want justice for people who are perceived as bad? You know, you have individuals commit a really serious crime. A terrorist does this, or some person does some heinous crime, violent assault, a murder, or something like that. And 1 Corinthians says, love is patient and kind, is not jealous, does not act unbecomingly, does not seek out for the bad for other people, basically. And I was talking about that on a Sunday morning. This person says, well, is it wrong for me to seek bad for this person? I would distinguish between interpersonal relationships where I say, I want you to get a zit because you were mean to me 10 years ago, is a radically different thing to say, I want this person to get arrested and get off the streets for the sake of the justice of society as a whole, for the sake of the justice of the victim of the crime, and also to protect other people. In fact, it's a very loving thing. Paul says, love rejoices in the truth. And that one phrase, I think, captures that notion, which is that it is not an unloving thing to say, look, that person is a violent criminal. I want them off the streets. I want to protect other people around them. I want to have the justice for the persons that they've offended. And because of all that, I long for not rejoicing in unrighteousness, but rejoicing in the truth. But that's a huge difference than I'm mad at this person from 10 years ago about something they did to me, and I want to get even for them. Now, that's not a criminal thing. That's more an issue of lack of forgiveness and mercy and compassion. And I think Paul would distinguish that. In fact, I could prove that because Paul in 1 Corinthians actually has the church put a man out of the church who's involved in some immoral activity. And he wants them to do that out of the sake of justice for the congregation and protection for the congregation. And so even Paul can distinguish between love for our neighbors over minor offenses that occur on a day-to-day basis where we need to let those things go and not pull for their bad but pull for their good, as distinctive from corporate justice and corporate righteousness that must also take place. It is a loving thing to have a just society. It is a loving thing to punish criminals. It is a loving thing for the rest of society and a justice of the society to rejoice in the truth and not unrighteousness. And so that's the distinction between those two. It's not a bad thing to want a violent criminal to get arrested off the streets and brought to justice, because we rejoice in the truth. All right, good questions. We'll see you guys on Sunday.